Welcome to a new episode of Projektion Kinogespräche, the normally German language podcast on film culture and film analysis. And today I'm talking English because I have a very special guest from the USA, Jack Fritscher. Hello, Jack.
Hello, Marcus. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine and really happy to have you here. And some people might not exactly know who you are. We will talk about this, and we will come to talk about a certain topic which is really relevant for our podcast. We covered it before several times, because William Friedkin died, unfortunately, last year, and we had a special on the film Cruising, and I did this book on cruising together with Eugenio Ercolani, which you kindly supported with a quote on the cover, and so I came across, and I have to say this to the German language audiences, many years ago, I came across your name in this book, which is the German version of Leatherfolk by Mark Thompson. And you wrote one of those chapters in there.
Hmm.
And so I was aware of your name, but I was not aware that you had a lot of yeah, influence and also a lot to do with the rising of the leather subculture in the USA. And you also had some contact in one way or the other. We'll talk about this with the film Cruising. So we start with one question. Would you say that the film Cruising by William Friedkin, featuring Al Pacino, shot in 1980, would you say that this film is just a document of days long gone by, like the leather scene at that time? Or would you say it is still very special and valid today? What would you say about this film today?
I think Friedkin struck a chord and captured the scene the way it was, so that Cruising basically is in its general shots of the streets and the costumes and the attitudes is a documentary of that time. In fact, just last night, I rewatched Cruising again to refresh my memory, and the very corpuscles in my body began to vibrate with nostalgia because it took me back to those nights, those streets, New York in that period, and to the mine shaft where all this glorious stuff went on that is now denied. A lot of people have denied what happened at the mine shaft, who denied what leather S&M was about. The Village Voice used to come out in its um, paper and denounce us as Nazis because vanilla gay sex has always thought that the leather folk were an embarrassment. But I find that the movie takes me back, at least, to a time and place in its feel and in its honesty with the way things were at that time after the glitter bomb at Stonewall went off and sent all these queens into orbit. But they did not understand leather culture, and so they have attacked leather culture as being the cause of all kinds of things from toxic leather masculinity to AIDS. So I think that in itself proves that the power of cruising remains on screen to incite people even today to respond to it, both positively and negatively in very visceral ways.
Mhm. Yeah. So, you were born in 1939, which makes you like a witness of a very long time, several decades of culture and also subcultures. And if I understand it correctly, you started studying and even teaching at university in
Yes,
literature. And
yes.
then you moved a little bit more into the subcultural vein and began publishing even novels and a magazine and so on. Probably you can tell us a little bit, how did you come into contact with the gay subculture and the leather subculture in particular?
I was lucky in that I grew up in the state of Illinois, where in 1961, when I was 22, having gone through my teenage years as an outlaw gay boy, in 1961, Illinois decriminalized homosexuality, and it was the only place in the United States that did so. So I had that good fortune, which allowed me to come out into the leather culture in Chicago at the Gold Coast Bar, where I really got an education because what I found there matched the fantasies that I had grown up with, basically coming out of World War II and my fantasies about men in uniform and how men in uniform collided for good or bad, and the look of men in uniform, the authority. So all that kind of pop culture stuff, as well as international world culture, came together in the gay bars where we put these items together. And then in 1964 in Illinois, there was a big to-do in Chicago because Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising was being shown at a local university. So a group of us leather guys got together and we went as a group in 1964 to watch this. And quite frankly, I, who have always been a film fan, I grew up on films, I've loved movies, I was blown away because for the first time I saw on screen men that I identified with who were doing things that in my fantasy I wanted to do in one way or another, not necessarily the way that Kenneth Anger had staged it, but he too gained a truth. And that movie is a precursor, it's a precursor to Born to Raise Hell, which was a drummer feature film in 1975, both of which led to Cruising in 1979, 1980. Those three films are matched together, and the two introduced really the possibility of Friedkin's Cruising. So there was this constant drum beat of S&M behind the vanilla culture that was capturing a lot of men's eyes because, well, at Stonewall, a lot of people came out. Nobody noticed that masculine identified gay men also came out because nobody really figured there were masculine identified gay men because the stereotype was that we were all sissies who wanted to be women. And that's just not the case. So the stereotype did not speak for the archetype of which we were in the leather culture. And even today, that leather culture is being resisted. Not 72 hours ago, I watched a preview screening of a new film on the mine shaft, which basically accuses the mine shaft of being the cause of murders in New York.
Mhm.
And of course, the mine shaft no more caused murders in New York than it caused AIDS. You know, there might have been a murderer who went there and a victim who went there, and they might have left together, but the mine shaft didn't cause it any more than Drummer caused violence in the streets by putting S&M consensual action on its pages. So there's a lot of confusion and a lot of uproar and a lot of gay passion today around this movie, which will not go away because it will last as an icon of the way we were in that 1970s period when we were all out sowing our wild oats and thought it was wonderful. We were allowed to follow our fantasies and do anything that we wanted within terms of what we thought was safe for ourselves. For instance, if you went into the mine shaft, just as if you went into any leather bar or any place, you had to figure out for yourself in your head what your limits were, how far you wanted to go. You could go into the mine shaft and see the most outrageous things, but that didn't necessarily mean that you were part of that. You might like it as a voyeur and it might turn you on so you could go do your own scene. But in rooms where there were 300 to 600 men a night, I mean, you had your choice of what you wanted to do and also the provocation of other men who had come from around the world who were offering up for your viewing pleasure what they were doing, new ideas, new concepts, new perversions, a new perversatility, if you will, that allowed us all to grow and finally express ourselves in a way that the timid uh, gay liberation movement did not allow us to do, because gay liberation did not want to include masculine identified gay men or leather men. I mean, the whole editorial policy of uh, the Advocate was totally anti-leather, because the publisher wanted only respectable gays in suits out demonstrating in the streets in the 70s. And that certainly was not the people who were out in leather at midnight at the bars.
I have a question concerning the novel Cruising. Have you read it by Gerald Walker? The around
I read it
1970?
I read it years ago, yes.
Yeah. And because this novel actually, as not many people probably know, because it was never translated in German, is not about the leather scene. It is
No.
actually about a killer roaming the gay scene, but it's the conventional gay scene, if I might say that. And so the inclusion of the leather scene was an idea, as I understand, that William Friedkin came up with,
Hmm.
because he was aware that the gay scene changed in the 70s and he found it much more interesting and much more inspiring to go to these clubs compared to the others. So, but I read the novel like 2 years ago, and I think it has reservations about gay men, and it's not a gay positive novel. What would you say? Do you remember it a little bit?
I don't remember it very much now because it's been years. I read it back in the 70s.
Mm,
But you know, that I mean, besides that book Cruising and the movie Cruising in the 70s that people say is so horrible because the it makes gay people look bad, leather people look bad, gay people look bad. The same, you could say, Cruising, the book, also caused Looking for Mr. Goodbar.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
definitely.
that's the same premise as Cruising, but nobody goes out and screams that because there was a killer, he makes everybody who is in the same group as the killer seem like killers.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people who have no critical ability jump on Cruising and start waving their political banners, and they never look at it as art or with any intellectual insight, because they cannot get over their emotions that this movie is something they fear the way they fear leather culture. I mean, if people wanted to hate Cruising or hate Friedkin for Cruising, they should have hated him for Boys in the Band, because there's a really trashy take on gay people. I remember when I was teaching university and I thought, well, I'll have my students go see the Boys in the Band, but I had to give caveats because I was frankly embarrassed that my students might think that gay people were like the characters in Cruising, which they weren't any more than you could say that the characters in the movie Cruising are real people, are based on a real kind of person. In fact, I found in the movie itself, I don't know how it was brought into the novel, but I think Friedkin brought leather people into it in kind of an abrasive way, however, because in the scenes in the bars and in the interactions between the gay men while they're cruising and all that, frankly, I never experienced one-on-one aggression and fighting like that. In fact, in all my years of being in gay bars, I've never seen a fight in a gay bar. I might have seen somebody, giving somebody attitude, but punching and fighting and shoving around, it just didn't happen.
Mhm.
And so I think there's a genesis from the book to, I mean, I don't even know why Friedkin based it on the book. He could have
Mm.
made it just as easily.
Yeah. I think it has the basic idea of the cop going undercover,
Uh-huh.
which is probably the same idea, but the main inspiration came from his police consultant, who also has small roles in several of his films,
Right.
who had also a task to go undercover at some point, and also in the context of the gay scene as well. So
Hmm.
it's quite interesting how he mixed then real accounts, and actually some real murders taking place. And I covered this in the book, and you probably will remember that there was an extra in The Exorcist who turned out to be one of the killers of real murders in New York, taking place in New York. And so he was able to interview this killer because he knew him from the shooting of The Exorcist,
Yes, I've
which is,
seen interviews with him, with the killer,
yeah.
actually, who's dead now.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, he passed away in prison.
Hmm.
Um, but there were murders that happened in New York all over the place.
Yeah.
A couple of them were, I mean, I remember Wally Wallace, who was the founding manager of the mine shaft, told me that one time they were having a Mr. Mineshaft contest, and he recognized that the winner looked very familiar to him. So when the contest was over and they were still, you know, having the festivities on stage, Wally went to one of his friends and said, "Is that so and so?" And the friend said, "Yes, that's so and so who killed our mutual friend. He did 3 years in prison and now he's out again, and now he's just been elected Mr. Mineshaft." Well, Wally went up on stage and invited the contestant back on stage, ostensibly to congratulate him, and then tore him to shreds and told the crowd he never wanted this creature back in the mine shaft again, and they drove him into the streets. And then later, after, I think it was shortly and after the mine shaft was closed, well, it was closing, or right after it closed, there was the murder of Igel Vesti in New York, a very famous, I think he was a designer, and he was famously murdered. And of course, if there was a leather belt in the room, automatically, if the
Mm,
man
I
wore a
see.
leather belt, he was, oh my God, he's a leather man. He's one of these people. They're
Mm,
demons from hell, because we were demonized by the rest of gay culture in the
mhm.
press constantly. I mean, you can't have the Village Voice calling leather culture Nazis in 1975, the very same year that Drummer was founded, uh, and think that there's an accord between the vast number of people out there who believe one way. They're a fundamentalist group, basically a far leftist, or very fundamentalist, believing what they believe on the face of it without any critical ability stirred in, so that they could at least make an intellectual pitch for why they were not wanting cruising. But if you think of the mob that was in the street against cruising,
Yeah.
they were ignorant. They never read the script.
Mm,
They knew nothing about it. They were censors in the street screaming for blood and blowing their whistles. That's the same crowd that through the 70s hated Robert Mapplethorpe and
mhm.
gave him nothing but grief for his leather photographs, which have now become so classic
Yeah.
that they define American photography. I mean, they did not recognize then that one of the great artists of the 20th century was creating stuff to document the art, to document them. All they could look at was the flat surface of the pictures, and then bitch, moan, and scream.
Mm.
Just like some people would say Drummer was just horrible. But I know famous bold-faced names of people in art and literature who were on our subscriber list. So while they were saying one
Yeah,
thing in
that happens
public,
often. Yeah.
they had copies of Drummer under their mattress.
I would like to talk about this a little bit more. And let's go back to one person I want to ask you about, namely Tom of Finland. Because
Uh-huh.
Tom of Finland was recently covered in a feature film from Finland,
Right.
obviously, and which was not bad,
It
but
wasn't bad.
it was interesting because it revived the memory of Tom of Finland and what his function probably was promoting these things. And
Hmm.
what would you say? What is the importance of Tom of Finland for this scene, and how did you draw inspiration, probably, for the drama magazine, if you did?
Well, Tom of Finland is an origin story of leather because he started early. One time I had the good fortune to host a drummer supper for him, a private little supper with about 8 or 10 people. And so we got to know each other. It was his first visit to America in 1978.
Hmm.
And he told me that his first erotic turn on was when the Germans invaded. And when there was an invasion, he became totally turned on by the erotics of the theater of it. The costumes, the uniforms, the strutting, the men, all the things that are cliches about that you see in movies. Those things that appear in movies, the cliches of that time. That turned him on, as it did us, because I can remember during World War II going to the theater, and in between the musical, it was a double feature, and in between the musical and the Western, because there was no television, there would be newsreels of the war. And there we would see all these men in uniform of every country, and those men all looking, beautiful and always filmed in beautiful and heroic ways, basically, or showing up that way. And in the war movies made at that time, uh, turned on little boys like me, because a lot of leather and S&M is counterphobic behavior. That is, you act out the very thing you're afraid of. So there's a whole generation of us war babies, in which I include Tom of Finland,
Hmm.
who grew up on the Second World War and were infused with that. And if you think about it, we war babies born in the 30s and 40s, we're only in our 30s in the 70s. So when
Hmm.
you see pictures of people standing outside the Ramrod and other bars in New York or any place else, those are all war babies who grew up on the Second World War, all ready for Tom of Finland. Now in 1950s, as I would go to Chicago, escaping my little town, I found little magazines like Tomorrow's Man, in which they had pirated copies of Tom of Finland's drawings.
Hmm.
And so, in a world where there was not much erotica, not much pornography in the 1950s, we'd buy those things and cling to them. And you could take a drawing of Tom of Finland and look at it and spend a week jerking off. Whereas now, if you turn on Pornhub, you have to go through 20 videos before you can find anything you like. We become so spoiled. But back then, we weren't spoiled. We valued everything we got, so we took it to heart. And while I never adopted anything that Tom of Finland himself did, he certainly helped grow the look
Hmm.
and the aesthetic of what leather looked like. Just like Rob of Amsterdam grew that leather look and commercialized it when he became, I think, the first and pioneering leather designer. And so he liked Tom of Finland. Robert Mapplethorpe liked Tom of Finland. He photographed Tom. Tom drew Robert.
Hmm.
There was a fraternity among us all,
Hmm.
but we were a shunned fraternity in the gay mainstream. We didn't care because we had all the power and glory of the homomasculinity, and homomasculinity is a key word of the leather world. So in the 50s, Tom of Finland came in, and then in the 60s, uh, small magazines were coming, even more small magazines were coming out. And Pulp magazine began in the 1960s with a magazine called Luger, named after the pistol.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Uh, so
So
you see,
there's actually a cult of militaristic things connected to this, as you said.
absolutely,
Hmm.
because the militaristic thing signifies discipline.
Hmm.
Discipline men, because gay boys were not allowed to be in gyms in high school. We could never be in the military. So those very things that we feared, we acted out in our leather life. We'd act out initiations and we'd act out, boot camp. Those became our fantasies because we never had that opportunity to live the reality that straight boys were living. And so in the 60s, this militarism came out. I remember I was in Holland in 1969, and I had brought with me a shirt that had epaulets on the, it was khaki,
Hmm.
and it had epaulets on the shoulders.
Yeah.
And I wore it out one afternoon and I was immediately told to go take it off because I was told that was not considered proper
Hmm.
because it looked too uniform-like. So, you were getting all kinds of pressure and feedback from both sides of things about the militarism,
Hmm.
about the costumes and fetishes of militarism that are inherent in leather culture that was growing that made ultimately film like cruising possible. So when after Kenneth Anger, and of course Kenneth Anger in '64 with Scorpio Rising, also added to that militarism.
Mm.
But now the men, and it weren't just soldiers on motorcycles, they were now leather guys on motorcycles, but it still looked very militaristic. And of course, it was blasphemous and all that. So it made the '60s, which is a time of great rebellion, those swinging '60s.
Counterculture, yeah.
Yeah, so it made it an impression on us. And all that added up to things like the need for literature. So Chuck Renslow in Chicago, who was the founder of the Gold Coast Bar, one of the first leather bars in the world, he was also a photographer who influenced Mapplethorpe through his magazine, through his Chris Studio, which he had in business even before Jim French had Colt Studio in business. And both of them were promoting the militaristic discipline and muscles and rigidity and hardness, because leathermen want to be hard men, uh,
Hmm.
just like everybody that watches a Guy Ritchie film, right? So they wanted to be hard men because if you had a hard leather persona, it was a shell of defense against the attacks from the world. Because as far as the straight world is concerned, we weren't gay enough because we weren't sissies. And as far as the gay world was concerned, we weren't gay enough because we were too much like straight
I
guys.
see, yeah.
We were damned by both
Like
cultures.
like ultra masculinity in a way.
Well, yeah, but when you go into ultra or hyper masculinity, that sounds um, medical in a
Hmm.
sense,
Yeah, sure.
psychological.
Hmm.
I say non-toxic heteromasculinity, highlighting the best that men do, not the worst. So that's what I saw in the bars. I didn't see people mistreating people
Yeah.
because they were big butch men. I saw people having sex with other people, and they were kind of building their manliness and playing their manliness off of each other, because manliness was the very thing denied to us all as children.
Hmm.
Because even if nobody said to me I was a little sissy faggot, I could hear when Johnny Ray was singing on the radio or Liberace was playing on the television, and the comments that people were making, that I thought, oh, I'm kind of like those guys. And if I'm like them, people are going to say this shit about me. And I don't want that shit about me. So I'm going to hide. And then
Hmm.
I took my hiding into the closet of leather.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I could come home to my parents' house and open my suitcase as I was on my way to San Francisco. And if my mother came into the room and saw my leather jacket and my chaps, he rides a motorcycle. But if I'd come in and had drag in the suitcase, there would have
Hmm.
been, what's that all about? But there wasn't any question about it because it was acceptable to our parents. They couldn't see through it, but what they saw of it, they thought, well, if this is something, it's better than the other thing, whatever this is. You know? And this is not to say that effeminate gay people and all kinds of the genders around that do not have their own rights and proper place and all that. I'm just
Sure.
speaking now for one subgroup that nobody suspected was even there,
Hmm.
because nobody came out to free masculine identified gay men.
Hmm.
Nobody thought we existed, so nobody tried to free us. We
Hmm.
had to free ourselves, and we only did that through the press and through our movies. And that's why pop culture, gay pop culture, leather pop culture, movies like uh, Born to Raise Hell and Cruising are so important, because they're documents that that are kind of like markers along 2 decades that bring us up to the point where AIDS caused the stuff to stop, as far as the orgiastic playing together was concerned.
As you bring up AIDS, which has a very tragic role in all this because a
Yes.
lot of very important people suffered from it and died from it. I would like to ask you about a particular Frenchman who is rumored to be part of the San Francisco leather scene, which is Michel Foucault. Do you know anything about this? Have you ever met someone who has seen him or anything, or is it just a rumor?
Not a rumor.
Okay. Okay, keep going.
Well, let's say that Michel Foucault knew his way around Folsom Street. He was not a stranger to the Slot Hotel, which was a fisting palace. He was not a stranger to the Barracks, which was San Francisco's equivalent of the mine shaft. In fact, Wally Wallace said that he got his idea for the mine shaft, particularly the bathtub at the mine shaft, from our barracks in San Francisco. And as a frequent patron of both places uh, in San Francisco, and knowing the people I know and knew, let's say that the people that Michelle was meeting in Berkeley in the afternoon had no idea of how he had been impaled the night before.
That's very interesting. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I heard these things, but I was
I
never
mean,
sure.
really, why do people think that he came to San Francisco and sat in Grace
Yeah,
Cathedral? I mean,
yeah,
he came to
absolutely.
San Francisco to play. But I will also tell you, as an adjunct of that, that in the early 70s, I was still teaching university. So I would come out during summer vacations and during winter and spring vacations. And there was a group of us who always showed up then. It was like the swallows coming back in the spring because we'd all laugh because we were all university professors who would come in and be doing research on our knees at the slot and the barracks and the glory holes and all that. So Michel Foucault was in good company. So he could actually go out in the afternoon and meet other university types and spend the afternoon with them if he so wanted to,
Yeah.
because there was a social life built around it. But people shouldn't think that just skanks came into these places.
Um, I can give you another access. Um, as we were talking about a Frenchman, Michel Foucault, I came across in my mind another Frenchman, Jean Genet. Would you say that the writer Jean Genet has been of inspiration or influence for the subculture? Because it's a very intellectual idea of a sexual subculture is kind of problematic, I understand. But funny thing is that Rainer Werner Fassbinder made around the same time when Cruising came out, he made his final film based on Jean Genet's novel Querelle de Brest. And Querelle is the last film by Fassbinder, and it's really this ultra gay, leather based fantasy.
Mhm.
So, would you say that Jean Genet has this influence on the subculture?
Oh, yes, indeed, he does, because he's mentioned quite frequently by leather people who, uh, reflect upon what they're thinking. I mean, people out there in in the bars may not know that, but people don't always know who the intellectual creative geniuses are behind something that they're very involved with. So Genet in writing and film is certainly the archetype progenitor pioneer who emboldened everybody from Kenneth Anger to all the gay film, all the leather filmmakers, all the gay filmmakers, I think really the leather ones, to make the films they made, because that gave us freedom, because he was respectable to us intellectually, and he was French, which in America gives you a vibe.
Hmm. I see.
So playing on that, I mean, no, Genet was terribly important to all of this because of the kind of explosive erotica of his images,
Hmm.
of his intellectual take on something. I mean, I think he was extremely influential on Mapplethorpe, for instance.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Uh,
you can see that. Yeah.
so uh, his effect is felt, I think, throughout. I even felt it in Drummer. Of course, I couldn't uh, pump that in Drummer because that's not what Drummer was about necessarily. But you know, Genet and Kenneth Anger and Warhol and the Marlboro Man, all these things were in my head when I created that first issue, that first generation of Drummer back in the 70s. I mean, many people helped create it. I didn't create it by myself, but
Hmm.
those were the impulses in my intellect as I was figuring out what can I put in this magazine so it can turn people on and entertain them at the same time that they're getting erotic pleasure. Because erotic pleasure coming in on top of an intellectual message can sometimes drive that intellectual message home, and in a way that they wouldn't accept it if it weren't attached to erotica. I had the good fortune in 1968 to be one of those young university professors who helped found the American Popular Culture Association,
Hmm.
which said, don't wait 50 years to look at something like we're doing today at Cruising.
Absolutely, we are doing that now.
Don't
Yeah,
wait 50 years. Look at it right now. Look at the Supremes right now while they're happening in 1968 and
yeah.
examine that. And as a result, even earlier that in the 60s, I had to fight my graduate school department because I wanted to write my dissertation on Tennessee Williams and the S&M violence and the leather violence in his stories and plays. But they wouldn't allow me to do it because he was still alive. And I said, well, that doesn't make any difference because he has such a voluminous career to this point and nobody's looked at any of it. There's, 10 plays and 100 short stories we can check out and study and write about and analyze and apply scholarship to. I convinced them to do that. And as a result, I ended up writing a dissertation about him and violence and in his plays, which are oftentimes about leather and S&M. People don't realize how much of
Mhm.
an S&M writer Tennessee Williams actually is.
Absolutely. And this might be an inspiration to actually rediscover his works.
Right.
Uh,
Read a short story of one called One Arm
mhm.
about a one-arm boxer in prison, or Desire and the Black Masseur, which ends up in cannibalism, just like Suddenly Last Summer,
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely.
which is another S&M story.
Yeah. That's an interesting aspect as well. And there's another person I want to ask you about, Pier Paolo Pasolini. He's not exactly a leather guy, but he unfortunately, ended his career and his life at the same time with a film, Salo, on Italian fascism and adopting a Marquis de Sade in a way. Has there been a reflection of Pasolini's work in the subculture?
Oh, definitely. In fact, in 1978, I wrote a major review of Salo because people were afraid to look at it.
Hmm.
They thought it was too violent, too horrible. They weren't going to look at it. They suddenly got their panties in an uproar. And so I thought, now's the time, because let me explain this. In the 1960s, because universities were a hotbed of unrest and revolution, the conservatives began defunding universities. And since then, they've done an excellent job in defunding all of American education. So basically, people now get nothing. There's no critical ability in America at the moment. So just as these mobs in the street had no critical ability to attack cruising, I had to I had to introduce some critical ability things into Drummer so people could understand Pasolini, whom I
Hmm.
adore. Um, and I told them that this is how fascism begins in a country. People capture you, then they tell you, like in Salo, you will marry these people, you will not marry those people. They will cut out your eye if you see things they don't want you to see. If you speak, they will cut out your tongue. People were confusing this fascist violence with S&M, which it
Hmm.
wasn't. I had to
Definitely.
help the leather culture segue with this kind of smoothness between what S&M was and Pasolini was warning about with his very strong metaphors. I mean, I so love Pasolini that I've actually traveled to Ostia and laid red roses on the beach where he was killed.
That absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, I had to. I just
Ostia,
had
yeah.
to. He's so important. So not only was he reflected in Drummer and in leather culture, but he was actually featured in Drummer as a major leather player.
Mhm.
Not of the kind, well, I mean, I'm sure he had rough sex. I mean, what do you call, hustler sex?
Mhm.
But I don't think he might have been killed by a hustler, but hustlers can be hired to hustle anything, including a murder. So
Yeah.
drove what car and why?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, I wrote my PhD on Italian films of the 70s, like Il Conformista and The Night Porter by Liliana Cavani.
Yes, I adore Liliana Cavani. I
Yeah.
adore Night Porter.
Our last episode on this podcast was about Liliana Cavani and her whole oeuvre.
Hmm. Brilliant filmmaker, brilliant filmmaker. Um, and also at that time, there was Lena Wertmuller
Yeah,
and her Seven Beauties.
absolutely. Yeah.
And those were two films that we covered in Drummer
Mhm.
because they also Ilse, She-Wolf of the SS was one we covered, even though it was a sexploitation movie at the
Yeah.
time. It now reflects as authoritatively as Cavani and Cavallari do. What the 70s was about, because the 70s in America was the main theme was fascism. In 1972, of course, out of the 60s came Cabaret. And in 1972, the movie hit the screens and took every award possible. And of course, that's about fascism. I see today people posting pictures of the artist Leyendecker and some of his fashionable young men from the 20s and 30s that he drew. And I had to, underneath one of these postings the other day on Facebook, I had to put the Tomorrow Belongs to Me segment of the young Nazis singing that song that rouses even a theater of people who aren't fascists to stand up in a theater. It's so beautiful and so rousing that you're carried along by the art of fascism. Because fascist art can be very, very seductive.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I had to say that that blonde icon can be played as an American ideal, but at the same time, it has to be looked at the other side of the coin too. And of course, that blonde ideal is something that has become hated in America because people think that it lords it over every other race and skin color.
Mhm.
Well, it does. It does. And it has to be balanced by bringing up other people from other backgrounds who can balance that. So yeah, in the 70s, and that was one of the things that I took into account in Drummer because we wore babies from the 1940s and Drummer out in the streets at the bars and the clubs. They were also the Drummer subscribers.
Mhm. Okay.
And
Yeah.
so they were interested in World War II things. But but we were also still in a war because the Vietnam War,
Mhm.
Came out in 72. The Vietnam War did not end until 1975, 12 weeks before Drummer first issue hit the stands. So gay men in the 60s and 70s had to avoid the draft and be either join the draft or be against it. But
Yeah.
it involved our lives intricately. So again, that militarism and considering it was very much part of the scene we were looking at, which brings up the rough stuff that, then blooms um, in cruising. Excuse me.
Yep.
In 1969, Stonewall was like a glitter bomb that went off, but nobody realized that a 70s leather culture was going to be one of the, big fireworks that went off after that. And they didn't realize that in 69 with Boys in the Band and uh, and Stonewall, that by 1980 you were going to have leather culture and cruising.
Yeah.
What a difference 10 years can make.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, when I visited Torture Garden events in London in the 90s, Torture Garden is the biggest European-based fetish club. There
Hmm.
were a lot of people wearing actual Nazi uniforms, and you mentioned this before. And in cruising, you see glimpses of actual SS officer caps, and you see the eagle and some of the symbols, but not whole uniforms. So in London, I was talking to people about this as well in London, and it was considered totally fine to wear Nazi uniforms, complete reconstructions of uniforms in fetish clubs. Um, did that happen actually in American clubs as well, that people wore complete uniforms, or was it just glimpses or parts of this?
Well, uniform clubs were a very important part of leather culture,
Yeah.
and every kind of uniform was honored. I remember people trading back and forth on Nazi little pins for, on the coat and all that, trading Nazi medals and so forth, and Nazi regalia. And those were worn, but it was almost like the producers,
Mhm, mhm.
Nazis
Kind of an
marching through France in little leather pants. It was
okay,
considered
yeah,
a comedy. But also, if you look at cruising, the evidence is right there. There's some people in cruising wearing Nazi insignia.
yeah.
But then there's another scene where the whole room is filled. I mean, it's absurdist comedy, and it's Friedkin's wonderful genius. They're looking, there's cops all over the streets
The
looking for
cop night.
cops wearing disguise. And there's a scene in there where everybody in the mine shaft is wearing a cop uniform.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's just like cop uniforms to the absurdist comedy level.
Mm.
It's wonderful how he takes that on and shows that all the different levels that cruising is actually operated on. Now, cruising is basically a very simple film. You could storyboard it on your own in an hour because there's nothing tricky about it. It just moves from one set piece to another. And it's not brilliant filmmaking, but it's good craftsmanship for a leather noir film. And that's what it is. But it has, instead, like in noir movies, they always end up in some nightclub where some singer is singing at a microphone, and in a little while they pay attention to her. Well, this is, being in the noir mine shaft, but there's
Standing
all
around a bathtub.
yes, there's all this, you know, this musical comedy going on inside. And Wally Wallace himself was a theater major, and he designed the mine shaft to be like a theater set that kept the cast moving through it at all
Mhm.
times. Also, one thing about the cruising, the only bad part of it was that in that movie that misrepresents anything is nobody danced at the cruising. If you
Mhm.
danced at the mine shaft, if you danced at the mine shaft, they'd throw you out in the street.
I see. Okay. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you this. There's a huge discussion about the use of music in cruising because cruising has this cult soundtrack, which features a lot of like American early punk rock songs and
Mhm.
hard rock songs. And I read everywhere that that was not the music which was actually played at those clubs. And as you say, people weren't even dancing. Do you can you tell me which music was actually played there?
Uh, well, I asked Wally Wallace specifically, said, we did not play we carefully curated our playlist. There was no music that said, let's dance.
Mhm,
They played Ella Fitzgerald. They played classic cuts.
mhm,
Um, it was an array of stuff, country, western, and so forth, but all of it was kind of calculated to be mood music to enhance the male eros in the room
mhm.
and not subtract from it. Also, the music to Wally was not important, and nobody went there to listen to Tim Buckley sing Sweet Surrender.
Let's see.
And that was one of the number one songs played at places like the Slot and the Barracks. I mean,
Mhm,
you could just swoon to Sweet Surrender and not even need poppers. But the point of the music at the mine shaft was it was never so loud that people could not talk
mhm, mhm,
because negotiation of scene was important. and if the music was too loud, you could not talk.
Absolutely.
And so
Okay.
there was only one room where this music was played. There wasn't music downstairs on the first floor. One thing I should say, there is no basement to the to the mine shaft. You only think it's a basement because when you go in, you go upstairs to the second floor, which then seems like the first floor, like the
Mhm.
main floor. But then you have to go downstairs
Mhm.
to the street level. In cruising, they go down,
Yeah, they go
Pacino
in the basement directly.
downstairs,
Yeah,
right? Like he's going down to a basement, but it did not
mm.
occur in the basement. Everything was ground level. That's what made it a safe space in terms of fire.
I see. Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
But
Yeah.
music was calculated so people could talk.
Mhm.
And Wally even talks about the social aspects of the rooms upstairs. I mean, I met some of the most intriguing people in the arts and letters that you could imagine there, and are chatting with each other and hit off friendships that lasted until these people died because we were able to talk after bawling. And you'd ball somebody that was hot and then talk to them later and, oh, you're you.
Makes sense.
I didn't know you looked like that. So yeah, the music was the background, and also the music is so almost subliminal. It almost sounds like more like sound design
Mhm.
in um, uh, in cruising. I also found it a little bit discordant because it seemed like it didn't really kind of fit what was going on. But maybe
Mhm.
that was a matter of budget or taste at that time. I don't
No,
know.
I think it was a question of concept because he actually didn't like what he heard there when he visited the club in Rio, and when they restaged it because the mineshaft was rebuilt, the interiors were rebuilt for the film in the studio. And he decided that he needs some more aggression and some more like music that makes you uneasy in a way.
Mhm,
And so it's yeah, you are right. It's sometimes it's sound design, sometimes it's really harsh rock music,
mhm,
and I think it's very important for the audience today to get an access to this on an aesthetical level, but it's not, obviously it's not the real situation there.
no.
But it's anyway, it's not a documentary, so I think it's the artistic concept there.
Well, the music he chose services the film, but it doesn't
Mm,
reflect the reality.
yeah,
He probably didn't want to have Ella Fitzgerald singing on the soundtrack because
right.
that would emotionally work different than the music he selected. Also, he probably paid nothing much for the rights to what he did use, and you'd have to pay a lot for Frank Sinatra and
Hmm.
Ella Fitzgerald and
Hmm.
some of these other cuts.
I see. Yeah.
So there's finances as well because it's obviously a low budget picture. I mean, there's not a big budget spent on this because you do know the dirt that Friedkin did to Wally about the mine shaft when Wally said that they could not shoot at the mine shaft,
Hmm.
right? That basically the movie company got the mine shaft busted and people taken down to the police station, the owners, Wally, down to the police station, and the helpers there, the workers. And then while they were in the police station, Wally told me, alleged to me, that the set designers went in and a photographer and shot the interior of the mine shaft because they'd originally come into the mine shaft and said, this is nice, but the ceiling's too low. We can't install any lights. But he wouldn't give them permission anyway.
Yeah.
So they shot the pictures of the mine shaft and then they went off and built a set in another sex club a few blocks away.
Hmm.
It wasn't done in a studio. It was all done on location
Ah, I
in
see. Okay.
sex
Yeah.
clubs. There's no studio
All
involved.
right.
That's what helps keep the reality, the verite of it kind
Hmm.
of going. It's a very simplistic film that just moves on and it keeps carrying you. And it scares you as it goes along because it's a horror movie. And it's
Yeah.
supposed to be a horror movie. And if the people in the streets were scared, well, they should have been scared because they were being manipulated by an artist who wanted to scare them. But don't
Absolutely. Yeah.
confuse the scare from the screen, that what
Hmm.
is on screen is actually scary in real life. Murderers are scary, but leather people aren't.
Hmm.
I mean, I never saw a gay culture that had more concern about consent than S&M and
Yeah, sure.
Leatherheads had from the
Mm.
beginning. You just didn't go. And if somebody, beyond the limits, and if somebody did go beyond the limits, word got around and he became, a pariah.
Yeah, I
But
think, yeah,
there was go on.
no, you gone.
I was just going to say there was this polarity between Drummer and the Mine Shaft. In Drummer, we wrote well, it was writing, so it was intellectual. You had to
Hmm.
look at it and read it. And we kind of wrote the script in Drummer, and then they made the film The Mine Shaft. There were polarities of the same behavior. It's just like Annie Proulx wrote Brokeback Mountain, and like, oh my God, there's a gay cowboy movie. I mean, what the fuck? We had gay cowboys in stories, hundreds of them,
All the time.
as if
Yeah.
it never, oh my.
Yeah.
How could she do this? Well, I don't know that she ever read Drummer, but I think Friedkin can certainly look through it because there's a scene where he pays homage to gay magazines when
Oh yeah, when he's cleaning
pulls
the
all the
room.
magazines out,
Yeah.
and he pulls out in the stack, you can see Honcho on the top.
Hmm.
But Honcho was a fake magazine that was real, but it was fake because it was imitation Drummer. It was
Okay.
started to compete with Drummer, just like so many other magazines were. They were clones of Drummer. Those were the real clones of the 70s.
Hmm.
And I tried to freeze frame it to see if I could see any other titles in that list. And I thought I saw the front cover of a Drummer go by, and I thought I recognized it because I think it was one of the covers I shot, but there was never any chance to see that where it appeared on screen where I could check it.
Hmm.
But I thought that was a great homage to his sources. When he opens up a closet door, and what does he find? Gay magazines and their contents, their writing and their pictures give him illustrations for the cruising novel. What person making a movie full of images and dread and needing costumes and atmosphere would not nearly faint opening up Drummer and seeing it all laid out there? A costume designer to look at, I mean, it's all there. So I don't think cruising could not look like it looks without Drummer.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely makes sense. What did you think about his use of flash cuts of actual pornographic scenes during the killing scenes? So it's like a flashing of really short glimpses of anal sex you see during the killings. What did you think of that? Because I find that pretty daring in a way to connect this actually.
Well, it's daring, but it's also a stereotype from the 60s when
Hmm.
filmmakers were making movies for stoned audiences. So they use flash cuts and measure the
Yeah.
screen, anything to keep the eye interested.
Hmm.
I think it's more trendy than it is, and it works as a subliminal because if you
Yeah.
remember back in the late 50s, there was a movie in which they did a study and they put the word hungry, eat popcorn on screen at a subliminal that nobody could read.
Hmm.
And they put a picture of, they just put the word blood on screen to increase the horror. The eye could not see it, but they were able to measure popcorn sales, and they found out that at the screenings where the hungry, eat popcorn sign subliminal came on, they sold more popcorn. And
Hmm.
that was back in the 50s. So subliminals were proven then, and they were then became a standby in hippie motorcycle movies,
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah. Easy
some
Rider, obviously. Yeah.
American international films with
Hmm.
Jack Nicholson. So that was put in for shock value
Hmm.
to increase, I mean, to increase what he could get away with. He was very frank in the fisting scene,
Hmm. Yeah.
but I thought it was very cute in quotation marks. Every time the Pacino was going to bed with somebody or anybody, any gay couples were going to bed in the movie, that it would cut away.
Mm. Sure.
Today we'd have the full scene, and it'd be on television and everybody say, oh, long form TV, how wonderful. but he didn't show that. The only people he showed in bed was when he was in with Karen, when Pacino was in bed with Karen Allen. There you got a bedroom scene.
Oh yeah,
Not
that's
so
true.
much with the gay guys. It was always cut away out of modesty, out of Puritanism. You didn't have to look at men having sex, really. It's like the old wisdom that the best violence is the violence that occurs off screen. The best sex is sex in your imagination off screen. So that I appreciated the flash cuts, but I also thought there was this Puritanism in the film
Hmm.
at that time, because I love when Friedkin and Weintraub talk about the film, and I've seen them talk about it.
Yeah, and the
They don't
documentary.
take any of the brouhaha about this, what went on in the streets, and that seriously. Just, we made a movie. It didn't do too well at the box office, but that was probably the times, and the fact that it had gotten this, it didn't have any gay following. And if you don't have a gay following for many films, nothing happens. That's why so many divas have gay followings. Who'd buy their records otherwise? So uh, he didn't have that appeal,
Hmm.
and the movie kind of tanked. But there was nothing in it really to recommend it, because there was nothing we hadn't seen, the leather people hadn't seen before
Hmm.
at all. He didn't break new ground, let's say.
So it's for outsider people more than for inside people.
Pardon me?
It's more for people checking it from the outside than from the inside of the
Right, it was
viewer.
made for people in movie theaters,
Yeah.
not for what we think of today as select audiences
Hmm.
watching at home.
Yeah.
It'd be quite different. But he had plenty of, like, if he had seen Born to Raise Hell, he would have seen fisting scenes there
Yeah.
in 1975. And I'm sure that if they did their proper homework and somebody on his crew was gay enough and leather enough to have known about uh, Born to Raise Hell,
Yeah.
that that was a reference point.
There's a lot of talk about Friedkin having shot those scenes, like pornographic scenes, when he was there, but he had to edit it out. So there is nothing ever seen of this. It's probably a kind of legend, and in interviews he is frequently asked about this. And do you know the James Franco film Interior Leather Bar, which is inspired by this in a way?
Or you could call it inspired. I would call
Yeah.
it something else.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I know it.
It's
I
it's a
mean,
talkative movie in a way. Doesn't make sense much.
well, it's kind of a sex comedy.
Hmm.
I appreciate him very much. I like
Hmm.
him, and it's unfortunate how he was trashed and ruined.
Hmm.
But I didn't care for it because it didn't. I mean, I thought he of all people would be able, James Franco of all people would be able to capture the spirit and out Friedkin,
Hmm.
and actually put together what Friedkin should have put together. But he didn't. He turned it into like an episode of Will and Grace.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's fine as a curiosity, as kind of satellite to cruising of what we're talking about. But this shows the importance and impact of cruising in the 20th century to gay culture and to American culture and to world culture, because it takes all these people from Genet to Foucault to the filmmakers, Kenneth Anger, all of them, and it kind of calls attention to them. It's like a push pin that attracts people, and they go and they look and see what are the little post-its under the push pin. And as they go deeper and deeper, things get heavier and heavier and scarier and scarier. And pretty soon they've gone down the rabbit hole and think, an hour later, oh my God, where have I been? What have I been thinking about? This is not good. But it is good. I mean, why are people afraid of the lower depths in themselves? Why are they afraid to look at extremities in themselves?
Hmm.
If you don't stretch yourself when you exercise physically, you never grow muscle. If you don't
Yeah.
exercise yourself when you're watching movies, you never grow aesthetic and intellectual muscle. I mean, these same yahoos that hated cruising, I say, hated Maplethorpe
Hmm.
because they
Hmm.
were uneducated. They could not, their emotions, their sexuality overtook their critical ability. And if somebody doesn't like cruising, you know, not to be snobby, but just think about what training do they have? Before education got dumbed down in high school, they used to get this kind of literary
Mhm,
interpretation. In college in America, everybody had to take literary interpretation as an introductory course in their freshman year.
mhm,
In 1968, I was one of those young college professors who introduced film studies into university curricula.
mhm,
And so I introduced film courses in the university English department. Well, the university didn't know what to do about it. The drama department screamed and said, "You're taking our stuff." And I said, "Well, you can teach film from a dramatic point of view. We'll teach it from a literary point of view
mhm.
so that when these students are learning how to understand fiction, poetry, and drama, the principles of critical interpretation, they can learn how to interpret a film." Because in 1968 and 69, my university students didn't want to hear about Leaves of Grass. They wanted to know what was going on in The Devils. They wanted to know what was going on in Bonnie and Clyde. How do you
Yeah.
interpret that? What's going on in Myra Breckinridge? I mean, they wanted to know all that stuff. So I had to arm them for their real lives by teaching them how to bring
Mhm.
critical ability to what they saw on screen, whether it was a Hollywood film or news on television. And
Absolutely.
that has all been wiped away now by the conservatives defunding education, now banning books. I mean, do
Mhm,
you think I could show The Devils now
mhm.
to my
Yeah,
university classes? I mean, you can't even have them
absolutely.
read To Kill a Mockingbird. So talk about fascism. Hello.
I absolutely agree because, yeah, being a university teacher myself, I have a lot of experiences that way. I'm teaching film studies, so I came across all these questions, and it changed over the last 2 decades
Mhm.
dramatically.
Right.
I actually had courses on transgressive qualities of film and so on, like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and we showed films like Salo or The Devils, but now it is really hard to convince. You have to convince the students to be willing to watch these things, because
Right.
otherwise they would complain about this, and
Right.
they would successfully complain. And I
Hmm.
would be questioned why I confront them with very extreme things which could traumatize them. But I totally
You
agree.
shouldn't be in college.
Yeah, it's I would say that, but it's really hard to handle this in the recent reality in universities.
Hmm.
And one of the last aspect I would like to discuss, I think, um, this what we talked about the last hour, the leather scene and the popular culture reflections of the leather scene, the philosophical reflections, in a way. um, Now we have queer culture, and the idea of queerness has changed a lot. Like the phrase queer, I think it appeared much earlier, like probably in the 80s, or I know it from the
Around
90s.
around 1990,
Yeah,
91, it started to shift with the
90s.
introduction of of queer studies. Yeah.
Okay, and but it was like a, a phrase connecting all kinds of different sexual identities under one umbrella. And today, it changed towards identity politics in a very narrow sense. What
Hmm.
is your having like dealt with all these topics over the decades? What is your reflection on this as a last question?
Well, Stonewall happened and gay liberation happened. And nobody knew that gay liberation was going to end up in traumatized by AIDS. And then, with so many of these people from the 70s who carried these torches died, the next generation and other genders came in and filled the jobs formerly held by these people, by men in magazines and so forth, and helped change things. But the worst thing that came in the 80s was the incoming of the politically correct left field Marxists. who wanted to change what they could change and destroy what they could not change. And that I saw come in San Francisco and destroy Castro Street and Folsom Street, because that far left kind of fundamentalism is the same kind as the religious right fundamentalism. Both have the same goal. They'll burn books, they'll trash books, they'll stone people virtually or really. It's a tragedy that the liberation shot of Stonewall was frittered away in this way, that substituted gay politics for gay religion, for gay liberation. You know, in cruising is the unspoken dark backstory of the kind of mafia and cop subculture that tyrannized the Stonewall Inn and all other bars in New York in 1960s and 70s. And that fascist subculture of cops and so forth, and now gay people, has not gone away. We're still dealing with it, but the people applying it are different. And I think we need to sort out who's who and who's speaking about what, because so many people have been silenced and so many people are afraid to speak out about how things were. But it has to do with the fact that both Cruising and Drummer and Leather deal with the virilization of homosexuals. And the virilization of homosexuals in a feminist age is not a theme that is popular. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying I endorse one thing or another. Please don't think that I'm off on one tangent about this or that. I'm just trying to lay out, as I would to a university class for their thought and consideration, how all these pieces might fit together. But the fact is what you saw in Cruising with the cops battering the gay guys around, it's the same thing as now. Mm-hmm. And in that movie, both the cops and the gay people are kind of like victims of the system. And that's why I think, at least to people who have a sense of history, who remember history, Cruising has a vibe to it that makes it more valuable now than ever, because it shows how we were, but it still needs an explanation. It needs scholarship around it, such as the kind that you have done in your writing and I've done in mine, because I quit teaching university so that I could work in gay culture, in magazines and publishing, and have a much wider, quote, student body. Instead of giving a lecture in a classroom to my 100 film students in each section, because there were 8 people sitting in Beowulf sections and 100 people in the film section, it evaporated, you know, when the class was over. But now if I talk to you on a recording, or you and I put it on the page, it lasts for those who want to read it, those who want to grow, those who want to access it. And it's not to contradict anything at all that anybody else says. It's just to add to the conversation. So I hope that nobody will misunderstand that I'm standing here with a banner for you know, S&M fascism. I'm not. In fact, I wrote a novel about gay fascism called Some Dance to Remember. So.
Yeah, I'm convinced it's pretty clear during our talk, and it will be really fascinating, full of insights, and it's a perfect ending. What you just said, it's returning to the film, and yeah, I think we covered a lot of things. I have to thank you very much, Jack, that you took your time and was talking with us and with me about this. And yeah, is there anything you would like to add in the end, or?
No, just thank you so much. I value your time, and keep doing what you're doing. Keep on keeping on. And I hope that there's students and viewers out there who will find your work and be able to look at some of these films, that were so popular because films about fascism in the 70s were so important to gay culture, that they will then be able to go back to these sort of culturally forbidden things now
Yeah,
and look at them for the genuine genius that they are, and people like Cavani.
absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you
Thank
to
you.
our listeners. And yeah, hope to talk to you again. Bye bye.
Bye.